Sapphire Bay Romance 2-pack, Holiday Bride and Holiday Magic. Written by Sandra Edwards. Narrated by Heather Masters. Holiday Bride, Sapphire Bay Romance, Book 5. Chapter 1. December 22nd. This was such a bad idea. Holly Sanders scolded herself as she walked across the lobby of the ultra-posh Sapphire Bay Resort. The pastry she'd had for breakfast weighed heavily on her stomach. She sucked in a breath, trying to elicit peace and tranquility. The sounds of Brenda Lee's rockin' around the Christmas tree filled the hotel lobby, doing little to calm the nausea building in her gut. She cast a cynical look at the enormous tree, lavishly decorated and packed with presents, all probably empty boxes, perched in the center of the atrium. It must have cost a mint to get that thing shipped to Hawaii. It wasn't Christmas that she hated. Not really. Every instinct Holly had told her to forget the tree, forget the cheerful holiday music, forget Hawaii, and run like hell before she ran into Mark Jacobs. It was bound to happen. They were both members of the wedding party. When Bree first told Holly that she and Gary had set a date and she wanted Holly to be maid of honor, Holly was thrilled, until it hit her that Mark Jacobs was the most likely choice for best man. Holly hadn't seen Mark in 5 years, not since she moved from Southern California to Seattle. She'd kept in touch with Bree, her best friend, but she hadn't spoken to Mark since the night before she left. It had been bad then, and time had not softened the blow he'd dealt her that night when he'd told her to go, saying he hoped she had a nice life in Seattle without him. Oh well. Holly was going to have to simply suck it up and put on a brave front until Bree and Gary said their I do's. After that, she could run back to Seattle, or at the very least, Aloha Airlines, as fast as her long legs would take her. Queasy feeling in tow, Holly made her way through the lobby and into the coral room where the female members of Bree's wedding party were supposed to meet. It wouldn't do for the maid of honor to be late. Standing in the open doorway, she saw Bree and her sisters and a couple of the other bridesmaids. Holly pushed herself to enter, instead of running upstairs and booking the first flight back to the mainland. Bree's eyes lifted. When she saw Holly, she smiled, stood, and moved around the table. Holly grinned and headed down the aisle. Each step she took toward Bree brought with it a sense of peace. By the time they embraced, Holly had practically forgotten about the nausea and Mark Jacobs. They were, after all, one and the same. Bree said, "I'm so glad you decided to come." They both knew what she was talking about. Holly's biggest mistake to date. She prayed Bree didn't mention his name. She didn't want to know about him, if he was involved, married, or even if he was here at all. Bree's jovial voice broke into Holly's thoughts as she added, "I couldn't get married without you." Holly laughed inside. She doubted that was true, but she appreciated the sentiment. "You know I wouldn't miss your wedding for anything." Not even to avoid her own humiliation, apparently. After landing in Honolulu, though, Holly had quickly come to realize that if it weren't for the 2,500 miles of ocean between herself and home, she might well have disappointed her friend by disappearing. Besides, Holly shrugged, knowing she had nowhere to go. Christmas in Hawaii? That's incentive enough. Mark Jacobs strolled through the entry of Sapphire Bay's Tidal Wave Lounge. Most of the tables were taken, and about half the stools at the bar were occupied. It didn't take him long to spot Gary at the bar with empty stools next to him. Walking up to his friend, Mark slapped him on the back. Gary looked up. When his eyes met Mark's, he smiled and said, "You're just in time. I ordered shots." Mark scanned the length of both sides of the bar. "Who were you planning on drinking with?" Gary shrugged. "I knew you'd show up sooner or later." Mark reached for a shot glass. He wasn't sure what was in it, but it didn't really matter. Gary was about to get married, and that was worth a toast. Mark poured the contents of the shot glass into his mouth. Whiskey. The good stuff. Couple more of those, and Mark would be feeling just fine. Or, at the very least, fearless. He signaled for the bartender, ordering 2 more. After downing the second shot, he turned toward Gary and asked, "So, did she show up?" Gary nodded, then knocked back his shot. He set his glass back on the bar and said, "Of course she did. Bree's her best friend." He looked at Mark and chuckled. "Course. We didn't tell her that you were gonna be here." "Very funny." Mark looked at the bartender. "Can I get a beer?" The bartender asked, "What's your poison?" "Corona." Mark had only to wait a moment for his beer. He took a drink before turning to Gary. "How's the water? It can't still be chilly after all these years." Gary snorted a laugh. "I wouldn't go in without a life preserver." "Well, you know me." He shrugged and took another drink. "I do like a challenge." Gary snorted. "You got your work cut out for you this time." Chapter 2. As they left the coral room, Bree turned to Holly and said, "Let's grab some lunch. I heard the Ocean View has a great buffet." "Sure," Holly said. "Where's Gary?" "Your guess is as good as mine," Bree snorted, then added, "Wherever he is, I'm sure he's doing something stupid." Good. Hopefully, whatever stupid thing he was doing, Mark was with him, and they'd continue doing it right up until the ceremony. That'd suit Holly just fine. She wouldn't have to speak to him during the ceremony, and the reception should be crowded enough that she'd have no trouble hiding from him. Holly and Bree strolled into the restaurant. Marla, the woman Holly had become well acquainted with when she checked into the hotel yesterday, was manning the hostess station. "Table for 2, ladies?" Holly nodded. "Yes, thanks." Marla reached for the menus but stopped short. "Buffet? Or would you like to see our menu?" Bree thought about it, then said, "Buffet." "Wonderful." Marla beckoned them with her forefinger. "Right this way." As they strolled through the dining area, she looked at Bree. "You're one of our Christmas Day brides, right?" "Yes," Bree said, a little over the top. Immediately, she giggled. "Maybe you'll be next," Marla said to Holly. "Is your beau here with you?" Holly shook her head. "Single and loving it." Marla smiled one of those pitying smiles that Holly often got from her mother when they talked about the big M, which Holly was not the least bit interested in. She'd given her heart to Mark, and look how that turned out. "You girls want to sit out on the terrace?" Marla asked. "Beautiful view." "Sounds perfect," Bree said. Marla glanced at Holly. I hear the best man is single. Perhaps you two should go for a drink. Holly looked at Marla, trying to contain the urge to shout. She tried shaking it out of her head, then said, "Uh-uh. Been there, done that. Ain't doing it again." Fair enough. Marla stopped beside a two-chair table on the edge of the terrace. One of our best tables, ladies. The buffet is right over there. Help yourself. She waited as the girls took their seats, then nodded toward the beach. Who doesn't love dining while admiring the surfers? The girls chuckled as Marla strolled away. Holly glanced toward the ocean as a Pacific breeze blustered past her. Pipeline waves roared toward the shoreline. Yesterday, she'd heard the bellhop refer to them as winter waves. Funny, it didn't seem like winter. Or Christmas. She had to admit there was something to be said for spending the holidays in Hawaii. If only Mark Jacobs weren't here. After they filled their plates at the buffet and returned to their table, Bree said, Have you seen Mark yet? Holly shook her head, more interested in the food on her plate than the biggest mistake of her life. If I know you, you're trying to avoid him altogether, Bree said. But you're gonna have to talk to him sooner or later. Holly looked at her. Why? Because you're both in the wedding party? Holly cleared her throat, shrugged, then said, That doesn't mean I have to talk to him. Bree rolled her eyes. You're not gonna ruin my wedding, are you? Of course not. And she wouldn't. But I'm not responsible for his actions. You play nice. You're overreacting, Holly said. I seriously doubt Mark is interested in catching up with me any more than I am with him. Bree let out one of those famous last words laughs. Her phone dinged, dragging her attention away from whatever amusing thoughts she had roaming around in her head. She glanced at the phone's display. It's Gary. She keyed in a short message, then waited. She didn't have to wait long. Her eyes lit up when she read his response. Bree smiled as she looked at Holly. He wants to meet me in the lobby in 15 minutes. She waited for Holly to say something, and when she didn't, Bree added, Come say hi. Holly glanced at her plate. 15 minutes? Sure. That was enough time to finish her meal. Okay, she shrugged, hoping that Gary didn't have a tag along with him. The girls wrapped up their meals. Holly slipped a 5 from her wallet and placed it under her empty glass. Bree did the same. Holly followed Bree out of the restaurant. Thoughts of running into Mark, very soon, rambled around in her head. Maybe accompanying Bree to meet Gary wasn't such a great idea. She dared to glance up, half fearful of seeing Mark standing beside Gary. She let her gaze drift around until she found Gary standing next to a lavishly decorated Christmas tree, the focal point of the lobby. The best part was that Mark was nowhere in sight. When they joined him, Gary kissed Bree sweetly, then greeted Holly with a friendly hug. Aloha, Holly. Merry Christmas. Same to you. Just when Holly was starting to feel comfortable that she wasn't going to run into Mark, he popped out from behind the tree. There he was, all 6 feet of him, looking like he'd just stepped off the cover of the Hawaii issue of GQ. The blue and black Hawaiian shirt hid all but a hint of the well-defined torso beneath it. the shirt's blue flowers giving depth to his crystal blue eyes. Mark raked his hand through his dark locks and shot Holly a grin that she wished she didn't remember. She glared at him for a long moment, making no move to smile or offer any indication that she was happy to see him. Then she let her cold stare drift away from him. He moved toward her. "I was hoping to see you before the wedding," he said, as he stepped in to embrace her. Holly stepped away from him. "Why?" He shrugged off her rejection. "Oh, come on. Aren't you glad to see me?" "You shouldn't ask a question unless you're fully prepared to hear the answer." "Oh, I'm ready." Holly shook her head. "I don't think so." Gary stepped between Mark and Holly. "Bree and I are going for a helicopter ride. You want to come?" he asked Holly. Glancing back and forth between Gary and Mark, Holly considered it. Odds were, if she went, so would Mark. Holly shook her head. "I don't think so." She stepped back toward the elevator. "You two go have fun." It was bad enough that Holly was going to have to participate in Bree's wedding alongside Mark. There was no way she was getting in a helicopter with him. Chapter 3. Marla Taylor strolled across Sapphire Bay's lobby, taking particular notice of Holly Sanders and Mark Jacobs, the maid of honor and best man for the Kelly Caples wedding. There was history there, Marla thought as Holly headed for the elevator with Mark hot on her trail. "Holly," he called. "Wait up." Holly stepped leisurely onto the lift, punched the button for her floor, then turned deliberately to look at him. He stuck his hand out to hold the doors open. "What?" Her sharp tone lashed out at him. "Have lunch with me?" he asked, extending his free hand to her. She looked at it for a long moment, then lifted her eyes to meet his gaze. "Granted," she said. "It might be amusing to see how your lines have evolved over the years." She paused again, letting a heavy moment stifle the space between them. "But quite frankly, when you've heard one, you've heard 'em all." A couple stepped into the elevator with Holly. Reluctantly, Mark let go of the doors, saying, "Just lunch. No lines, I promise." The door slid shut without a word or even an acknowledgement from Holly. Mark glanced at Marla. He shrugged and said, "She's crazy about me." Marla nodded. "Somebody's definitely crazy about somebody." He winked at Marla and strode off. Mark Jacobs was a glutton for punishment, she thought, as she watched him walk away. If he didn't lighten up, he was going to make Marla's job that much harder. "Oh dear," she said. "This one's going to take a Christmas miracle." December 23rd. Marla liked working the concierge desk because it provided a vantage point on Sapphire Bay's busy lobby. She could easily see the registration desk, the entrances to the ground floor restaurants, and the tower elevators that provided access to the resort's other restaurants. Yes, from the concierge desk, she was able to keep an eye on the comings and goings of guests and staff alike. She'd seen Mark Jacobs go into the Beachcomber by himself, and she hadn't seen anyone else from the Kelly Caples wedding party go into the restaurant. That guy sure knew how to alienate others, especially the maid of honor. She was not happy to see him. There was a story there, and Marla desperately wanted to know the details. She left the concierge desk and strolled toward the Beachcomber, where she scanned the restaurant until her eyes fell on Mark. He was sitting at a small table toward the rear of the dining room with his back to her. The table behind him, another small one, was empty. Marla lingered for a moment, then turned to head back to the concierge desk. That was when she saw Holly Sanders, the maid of honor, heading toward the Beachcomber. Marla said to the hostess, "I've got this one." She grabbed a menu and offered Holly a smile. "Table for one?" Holly checked her watch. "I've got a friend joining me in about 15 minutes. "Wonderful." Marla motioned for her to follow. "I've got just the table. It has a lovely view." Marla led Holly through the restaurant, taking her to the empty table next to Mark Jacobs. She was careful to stand between Mark and the empty chair behind him. "How's this?" "Perfect." Holly nodded and slid into the chair. "Can I bring you a Mai Tai while you look over the menu and wait for your friend?" Getting her liquored up was the only way that girl was going to warm up to the man behind her. That was for sure. Holly looked like she was going to nix the idea. Then her face brightened and she said, "Sure, I think I'll do that." Marla touched Holly's shoulder, saying, "Good. I'll get that to you in a jiff." Holly watched Marla amble away. She regretted lying to the woman about a friend joining her for lunch, but she didn't want to appear any more pathetic than she already did. Admitting that she had no one to dine with would seal the deal. Being stood up was better, although not by much. She also regretted, if only a little, letting the woman talk her into having a Mai Tai. With Mark Jacobs roaming around the hotel, Holly needed to keep her wits about her. But maybe just one wouldn't hurt. Moments later, Marla returned with Holly's drink. "You enjoy your lunch now, and you let me know if there's anything else I can do for you." "Thank you," Holly said, then tasted the Mai Tai. Not bad. She kind of liked it. Marla gave her a nod, then strolled away. John Mellencamp's rendition of "I Saw Mommy Kissing Santa Claus" reminded everyone that it was indeed the holiday season. Holly was starting to think she just might actually enjoy this wedding vacation, even though the last person she ever wanted to see was here. But if she played her cards right, she'd be able to avoid interaction with Mark outside Bree and Gary's ceremony. Holly sipped her cocktail and smiled. "So," a familiar voice blew in from behind her. "You're not really still mad at me, are you?" Holly closed her eyes. How had she missed that the hostess had seated her back to back with Mark Jacobs? Maybe if she ignored him, he'd go away. It sounded good, in theory anyway, but Holly knew it'd never work in reality. She sucked in a breath, then said, "I really don't have any feelings toward you, one way or another." "That's not what I heard." She almost fell for it. Holly almost turned to look over her shoulder. Thankfully, she saw Mark's ruse for what it was, pure BS, and stopped herself. "What are you, in grade school?" "If you're gonna insult me, the least you could do is turn around and look at me." Holly cleared her throat, then pushed herself around in the chair. She put forth her best glare, even though it was hard while looking into those radiant blue eyes of his. What she wouldn't give for a pair of sunglasses right about now. "See?" Mark said. That's not so bad now, is it? Holly looked at Mark for a long moment. Really looked at him. His handsome face beseeched her to forgive and forget. Holly blinked and shook the crazy thoughts out of her head. Look, I'll agree to be civil for Bree and Gary's sake, if you'll agree to keep your distance. From Bree and Gary? He asked with a half smile. Holly blew out a sigh. You're not going to make this easy for me, are you? Depends. On? He looked her over seductively. Have dinner with me tonight. Holly wasn't biting. As I recall, she said, we have a rehearsal dinner to attend tonight. I'll take that as a yes. Frustration boiled inside Holly's gut. She shook her head, stood, and headed for the restaurant's exit. Marla, who was undoubtedly acting as Mark's wing person, caught Holly as she tried to make her escape into the lobby. Now, you couldn't have had time to eat. She looked like she wanted to turn Holly around and march her right back to her table. Holly wasn't having it, but she tried to be pleasant when she said, I've lost my appetite. Chapter 4. Mark Jacobs decided to forget about lunch and head for the tidal wave instead. He didn't need food. What he needed was a liquid lunch. He had to figure out how in the hell he was going to win Holly back. And it wasn't going to be as easy as he'd thought. Most of the bar's patrons were seated at the tables along the windows. They were probably here for the view. Mark had come for the booze. He claimed a seat at the center of the bar, wondering which of the two bartenders would make it to him first, the guy or girl. The girl could easily distract him, but the guy would be far more understanding of his need to drink in peace. He wasn't sure if he was happy or disappointed when the girl came over. Aloha. She gave him a charming grin. What can I get you? She asked in a voice that was far too chipper to suit Mark. Scotch. Straight up. She nodded, grabbed a bottle, a glass, and began to pour. You're in paradise, she said. Why the long face? Mark shook his head. Long story. He wasn't about to spill his guts to a bartender. She set the glass in front of him. I've got all the time in the world. Mark picked up the scotch, downed it, set the glass back on the bar, and pushed it toward her. She remained silent as she poured. She looked him in the eye as she pushed the glass back to him. Mark put that one away as fast as he'd done the first. She raised a single eyebrow. Another? He nodded. Again she poured. He watched without saying anything. Must be a woman, she said, pushing the shot glass back to him. Mark snorted, then knocked back shot number 3. She stood there with a bottle of scotch in one hand, propped her free hand on her hip, and shook her head. You've got it bad. That why you're here in Hawaii? She asked, then added, trying to put some distance between the two of you? Finally, Mark lifted his eyes to look at her and said, I'm afraid it's worse than that. A wicked grin crossed the girl's face. She's here too? Her smile suggested she was deriving some sort of demented pleasure from the thought. Mark nodded. What? Did you have a fight? Mark shook his head. Believe it or not, I haven't seen her in 5 years. She won't talk to me. Won't even entertain the notion of talking to me. Her expression turned to one of pity. You break her heart? He nodded. Yeah, I guess I did. How did you two end up here in Hawaii at the same time? My best friend is marrying her best friend Christmas Day. So you can't even hide from her rejection. Her rejection. That stung. Mark blew out a sigh. Sad, but true. He had foolishly come to Hawaii hoping that Christmas in paradise would soften Holly's anger toward him. He could see now that that was going to take a miracle, because not even the holiday season was capable of melting her hardened heart. She's so pissed. There's no way she'll ever forgive me. What in the world did you do? The bartender asked. Did you cheat on her? No. Lie to her? No. Mark shook his head. I let her move away. I didn't try to stop her or go after her. He peered into the girl's eyes. And now she hates me. The girl chuckled a futile laugh. You are so screwed. Tell me about it. He tapped the empty glass on the bar. She started to pour again, but stopped short. You're not driving, are you? No, I'm staying here at the hotel. She nodded and poured him another shot. Well, if she's still mad at you, then she most likely still has feelings for you. Hope had found its way into his voice when he said, You think? But that doesn't mean she'll ever take you back. Damn. Just when he was starting to have hope, the bartender went and crushed it. So I'm doomed, he said, and it was no question. It's gonna take a miracle, she said. A really grand gesture to win her back. In her room on the 9th floor, Holly closed and locked the door. Now she felt safe. As far as she knew, Mark didn't know her room number, and she had to make sure it stayed that way. She pulled her phone from her purse and typed a message to Bree. Please don't tell Mark my room number. Bree. Why would I do that? Holly. Just making sure. Does Gary know my room number? Bree. No, at least I haven't told him. What's going on? Holly. Mark's trying to get back in my good graces, which basically means in my pants, and I just can't go there. Bree. I'm coming to your room now. Stay put. A couple of minutes later, a soft tapping told Holly that Bree had arrived. Just to be on the safe side, she checked the peephole before opening the door. It was Bree. Good. So why did nerves bundle together and threaten to choke Holly as she opened the door? Holly reached out, pulled Bree inside, and quickly closed and relocked the door. What's going on? Bree asked. Holly shook her head for what seemed like forever before saying, I just can't deal with Mark right now. Elaborate, please? They went to the foot of the bed and sat down. Holly looked at the tiny 2-foot Christmas tree on the table in front of them. Do you have one of these in your room? Yes, Bree said. They're in every room. Now quit trying to change the subject. Holly shrugged. Just curious. I thought you'd be okay as long as Mark left you alone. That's just it, Holly said. He's not leaving me alone. He keeps flirting with me, asking me to dinner. She bit at her frustration, letting it pour out in her hardened tone. Bree, I can't deal with this. I need him to leave me alone. Are you still in love with Mark? Bree asked, as if the realization had just come to her. The hotel room's phone began to ring. Both girls looked at it. Who on earth would be calling Holly on the room phone? She glanced at her cell on a nearby table. Anybody who knew her would be calling her on that. The ringing of the hotel phone had to be a bad sign. Holly looked at Bree. It's your room, she said to Holly. You answer it. That little voice inside Holly's head was telling her it had to be Mark. I'm not answering it. Bree shook her head and half laughed at Holly. She went to the phone and picked up the receiver. Hello? Holly could hear the male caller, but she couldn't make out what he was saying. Yeah, this is Bree. She looked at Holly, skewed her face, and tried not to laugh into the phone. No, afraid not. A slight pause, then she added, I wouldn't know. I haven't thought to ask her. There was more silence on Bree's end as she listened to the caller. Holly would put money on it being Mark. It had to be him. Nothing else made sense. Bree said, Come on, Mark. Don't put me in this position. If Holly wanted you to know her phone number, you'd have it. After another brief interlude, Bree bid Mark adieu, then hung up the phone. She flashed Holly an ironic smile before saying, He wants to know your room number and your cell. Holly practically felt the fire shooting from her eyes. I didn't tell him, Bree defended herself. Then her tone softened. He seems genuine. Holly snorted. Mark Jacobs? You're kidding, right? People change, Holly. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. You should talk to him. Why? If for nothing else, to tell him exactly how you feel about him. Bree studied Holly for a moment, then added, You know what you need? Closure. Closure? Closure. Holly laughed. I don't need closure. I'm fine. Her confidence began to deteriorate around her like a crumbling wall. Well, I was fine until I came here. Chapter 5. Christmas Day. You're leaving? Bree's tone matched her face, wide-eyed with disbelief. Before my wedding? No, Holly said. I'll be here for the ceremony. I'm leaving right after. And don't tell anyone. I can't believe you're gonna leave right in the middle of my wedding. I'm not leaving in the middle of it. Yes, you are. You're not staying for the reception. I can't stay here. Holly's tone was firm. He broke my heart once. I can't let him do it again. She sucked in a breath, hoping it'd fill her with courage and confidence. Both missed the mark. She was torn between her loyalty toward Bree and her desire to run as fast and as far away from Mark Jacobs as she could get. I'm sorry, Holly said. I should have known I wouldn't be able to handle seeing him again. Her shoulders slumped and she dropped her chin. I have ruined your wedding. Bree draped her arm around Holly. Don't be silly. I should have told Gary to choose someone else as his best man. Shoulda, woulda, coulda. Holly shrugged, then chuckled. He's proven that he's not going to bother you anymore. Bree was grasping at straws, and her tone confirmed that she knew it. Since when? He stayed away from the rehearsal dinner last night. For you. Yeah, that was the problem. Holly hadn't wanted anything to do with Mark when she arrived on the island. Then she got a taste of him. A reminder of what it used to be like to be showered with his attention and affection. She didn't want it, but she didn't not want it either. When he hadn't shown up at Bree and Gary's rehearsal dinner last night, Holly hadn't been sure if she was relieved or disappointed. She looked at Bree and said, "He stayed away because Gary told him to." Semantics. That's why I'm going to return the favor. He stayed away last night. Holly shrugged. So I'm going to give the reception to him. Bree blew out a defeated sigh. I still think you need to hash this thing out with him, she said. But if you're determined to go, I understand. By the time Holly was standing at Bree's side on Sapphire Bay's party terrace, she'd worked herself into a nervous tizzy. She could feel Mark's eyes on her, but she didn't dare look up to meet his gaze. The quicker the ceremony was over, the faster she could get the hell out of here and head home. Home. A place, by definition, that didn't include Mark Jacobs. That was sounding real good. Hurry up, she begged the preacher. Get me out of here. Holly didn't pay much attention to the back and forth between the preacher and Gary and Bree. She was more interested in her ability to execute the perfect getaway. She would have to time it flawlessly. During the congratulatory commotion that had come as soon as Gary and Bree were pronounced husband and wife. That was her best bet. When the announcement finally came, just as she'd imagined, a small crowd rushed toward the bride and groom, placing an effective, albeit temporary, barrier between Holly and Mark. She saw him trying to make his way to her. Holly backed up a few steps, then slipped into the portico leading back to the hotel. Adrenaline pushed her to run. If Mark caught up to her, she was doomed. He'd have his way with her, then leave her to return home, alone and broken-hearted. She would not let him do that to her again. Not if she could help it. She'd planned every step of her getaway down to the slightest detail. Luggage at the bellhop, a car waiting outside to take her to the airport, a flight that would take off within the hour. She climbed into the car, feeling a bit of the burden lifting from her shoulders. She was halfway there. If she could just get on that plane without Mark showing up, she'd be home free. From her chair at the bride and groom's table, Bree checked her watch. Holly's plane had been in the air for 15 minutes. She knew Holly was relieved to get away, but Bree couldn't help but think that her friend had missed out on her one shot at happiness. Bree knew what Holly couldn't accept. Holly was, had been, and always would be in love with Mark Jacobs. And the worst part of it all was that Mark was genuinely in love with Holly. But Holly's pride wasn't going to let her grab hold of her shot at happiness. Mark had made the mistake of letting her walk out of his life 5 years ago, and Holly wasn't going to let him off the hook for that. Mark slipped into the empty chair at Bree's side. If she hadn't already left, Holly would have been sitting there. Bree glanced at Mark. "Where's Holly?" he asked. "I really need to talk to her." Bree studied Mark, then said, "She's gone." "What do you mean, gone?" "Gone? Not here. Somewhere else." Bree shrugged. "Tell me her room number?" he asked, without the slightest hint of severity. "It wouldn't do you a bit of good to know that." "Come on, Bree. You know how I feel about Holly." Yes. Yes, she did know. Hell, Mark had poured his heart out to Bree and Gary at Thanksgiving. For all the good it did. "She's not here, Mark. She went home." Mark's brow furrowed. "When?" "She split as soon as Gary and I said I do." That revelation did little to clear up the confusion on Mark's face. "And you let her go?" Bree laughed. "Like I could stop her." "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "So I could stop her." "I don't know what you thought was going to happen when you showed up here in Hawaii." Bree hadn't meant to, but her lecture poured out. "Did you think she was going to welcome you back with open arms?" she asked. Mark's look of confusion turned to defeat. "You broke her heart, Mark. If you want back in her life..." Bree shrugged. "It's gonna take something big." Chapter 6. Valentine's Day, Seattle, Washington. Holly Sanders entered her apartment on the 8th floor of a downtown high-rise. She was glad to be home from work, where she could hide away until this dreaded holiday was over. She didn't want to go out tonight. She didn't want to witness all the lovers out there celebrating their special day. Bah humbug. She tossed her keys into the jade green bowl on the table by the door and glanced fondly at the photograph perched beside the bowl. The picture was of Holly and Bree in Hawaii. Holly blew out a wistful sigh. She'd thought she was going to have such fun in Hawaii. Of course. She'd deluded herself that she could face Mark again and remain indifferent. But her heart was still broken. The fact that he'd tried desperately to talk to her only made it worse. Since returning home, she'd had good days and bad days. On the good days, she patted herself on the back for not surrendering to his charms and her desires. On the bad days, she badgered herself, thinking that she'd made another mistake by not hearing him out. She hadn't decided yet what kind of day today was. Holly grabbed a glass, a bottle of wine, and the red heart-shaped box of candy she'd bought herself at the corner drugstore yesterday. That was all she needed: a bottle of wine, chocolate, and a good movie. She certainly didn't need Marc Jacobs. She made herself comfortable on the couch, then grabbed the remote off the coffee table, switching on the TV. The local news. She started to queue up Netflix, but stopped when she saw a familiar face. Marc Jacobs. What? A news anchor here in Seattle? What? This could not be. She turned up the volume. "Thanks, Jennifer," Mark was saying. He looked at the camera. "I'm thrilled to call Seattle my new home. I look forward to invading your homes every day at 5. A warm smile tipped the corners of his mouth. Holly's TV screen switched back to the anchor she was familiar with, Jennifer Porter. Jennifer said, "We just love Mark's story. For those who don't know, Mark has moved to Seattle to be closer to the love of his life. She paused, let out a chuckle, then said, Holly, call this guy. Epilogue. The following Christmas. Holly Sanders had never imagined getting married in Hawaii, even after coming here last year for Bree and Gary's wedding. But here she was. Bree was right, Holly thought. Being a holiday bride was great fun, especially since she got to do it in Hawaii, and Mark Jacobs was the groom standing at her side. Holiday Magic, Sapphire Bay Romance, Book 6. Chapter 1. December 30th. Jane Garwood followed her best friend Diane Fields to the reservations desk at Sapphire Bay Resort. Behind the counter, a middle-aged woman with dark hair cropped short and the bluest eyes Jane had ever seen looked at her with a smile. Checking in? Jane nodded and passed the reservation confirmation across the counter. She glanced at the woman's name tag. Marla. You picked a great time to visit Oahu, the clerk said as she keyed the information into the computer. There's nothing like spending the holidays in Hawaii. You said it, Jane chuckled. You girls will be attending our New Year's Eve ball tomorrow evening, won't you? Marla asked. Diane perked up. New Year's Eve ball? Yes. Marla beamed with pride. You'll love the glamour of it all. Dressed to the nines. If you're single, we'll match you with another partygoer for the traditional midnight kiss. How exactly will that work? Jane asked. Even though she wasn't feeling it, she tried to remain cordial. Please tell me I don't have to fill out any questionnaires. Marla waved off the idea. Oh no, nothing quite so scientific. We're going to let fate decide for you. Fate? Jane's skepticism was slowly becoming overpowered by her growing curiosity. Oh yes, Marla said. Magic works much better than science anyway. Diane looked at Jane with a wide open smile. Magic? Jane shrugged, saying, Let's hear her out. Her eyes drifted back to Marla. So, how exactly is this supposed to work? It's very simple, Marla said. When you walk into the party, you'll choose a gift. She shrugged. Inside the box is a trinket, a bracelet, a brooch, or a necklace. The single men at the party will have lapel pins. So we're supposed to spend the evening looking for the matching lapel pin? Jane asked. Marla shook her head. That won't work. You'll have to wait until the lights come on to find your match. Lights? Jane felt as confused as Diane looked. The trinkets, Marla said like it was common knowledge. Once they light up, it will be obvious who's matched to who. Jane glanced at Diane. The concept was an intriguing one. Diane said to Marla, And we get to dress to the nines, as you say? Most definitely. Marla smiled. Jane turned to Diane. We're going shopping. Jane hadn't brought an evening gown with her, and she didn't think Diane had either. They'd thought sarongs and bikinis would be the extent of their attire while in Hawaii. But no matter. Jane was certain they'd find whatever they needed for the New Year's Eve ball down in Waikiki. December 31st. The next morning found Jane and Diane standing next to the giant Christmas tree in Sapphire Bay's lobby. They'd only been there a few minutes when Marla came up to them and said, "Ladies, your car will be here in 45 minutes to take you to Waikiki." "Ooh, just enough time for breakfast," Diane said. "You'll definitely need a hearty breakfast before you go shopping." Marla handed Jane 2 coupons. "I'm sure you'll love our Ocean Views breakfast buffet." "Thanks," Jane said, scanning the coupons. "Good for 2 breakfasts at the restaurant." "Cool." She looked back at Marla. "Any advice for our shopping trip?" Marla practically laughed. "When you find a dress you like, just tell the clerk you might come back if you can't find anything more suitable in the other stores." She nodded craftily. "They'll most likely offer a discount on the spot." Jane let the idea ramble around in her head. "You know," she began to nod, "that just might work." All 3 women laughed. Then Jane and Diane headed for the ocean view, while Marla took off in the opposite direction. Cord Duncan elbowed his cousin Dennis as they stood waiting for the elevator. "Check her out," Cord said, watching this cute little number and her friend heading toward the Ocean View restaurant. His eyes stayed glued to her. She was tall and willowy with chestnut hair hanging halfway down her back, until she disappeared inside the restaurant. "Damn," he swore. "She's hot." "And way out of your league," Dennis laughed. Undaunted, Cord shook his head. "She's mine before the new year." He stepped away from the elevator. Dennis followed. "Where are you going?" "Breakfast," Cord said with a grin, then made a beeline to the registration counter to snag a couple of the little gift-wrapped boxes of candy the resort had sitting out for their guests. After snatching up his loot, Cord headed into the Ocean View restaurant. A hostess approached him, and Cord smiled. "I'm meeting a friend," he said, and went on past her into the dining room. He gazed around, looking for the 2 girls who'd gone inside moments before. He spied them at a table by the windows. With his sights set on just one of them, he headed for the table. "Happy holidays, ladies," he said, pouring all his charm into a smile for the girl with the chestnut hair. "Happy holidays," she said behind her own smile. "I doubt I'm the first," he shrugged. "And I surely won't be the last, but my sincerity is genuine." He handed them each a box of the candy he'd stolen from the registration desk. "I hope your new year is filled with love, laughter, and joy." "Thank you." The girl with the chestnut hair took Cord's candy. "Right back at ya." "Will you ladies be at the ball tonight?" he asked with a measure of hope. The pretty one nodded. "Yes, we'll be there." "Wonderful." Cord smiled. "If you're not married or otherwise engaged, I do hope you'll save a dance for me." He winked, then turned and headed out. No reason to wear out his welcome. Cord Duncan was well aware that most women liked the chase just as much as he did. Chapter 2. That evening, Jane followed Diane to Sapphire Bay Resort's party terrace, where the party of the year, they were told, was set to ring in the new year. Both girls were dressed to the nines, as Marla Taylor had said, thanks to their shopping spree in Waikiki. Jane had chosen a champagne gold gown, while Diane's had been described as starry night silver. Marla approached them. She was wearing a long-sleeve black gown that looked stunning on her. "I'm so pleased you girls decided to attend the ball tonight. You're going to love it," she said, leading them to one of the tables near the entrance. With a grand gesture, she urged them to choose a box and please wear it. A few minutes before midnight, your trinket will light up. When that happens, just look for the lapel pin that matches yours to claim your midnight dance. Jane and Diane stepped up to the table. Diane chose a green box with a red bow, and Jane went for the royal blue one with a white bow. Marla led them to a table on the edge of the dance floor. "Here we are. I think you'll enjoy this table." She winked at the girls. Before Jane sat down, she snuck a clandestine peek around the party terrace, hoping she'd see the flirtatious guy who'd given her candy that morning. Maybe she'd learn his name tonight, if he showed up. The thought that maybe he'd decided not to attend was deflating. "You're quiet," Diane said, opening the box she'd picked up at the door. Jane shrugged. "Just a little apprehensive." She finished her scan of the terrace, then looked back at the gift box she'd placed on the table in front of her. What if the guys we're paired up with just aren't our type? Then we'll dance with each other. "Okay," Jane said, "but I'm not kissing you." The girls laughed and opened their boxes to find brooches. Both pins were flowers, but were otherwise clearly different. They were silver, white gold, Jane would bet, with what looked like rhinestones. Jane inspected hers, but couldn't see a way for it to light up. She wondered about that as she pinned it on the strap of her gown near the left shoulder. "Good idea," Diane said, and followed Jane's lead. "Ladies?" A waitress carrying a tray approached them. "My name is Mary. I'll be taking care of you this evening." "Hi, Mary. I'm Jane. This is Diane." The waitress said their names while acknowledging them. "What can I get you to drink?" "I'll have a Mai Tai," Diane said. "I'd love a red lava flow," Jane said. "Great. I'll be right back," the waitress said, then took off. Mary returned moments later with a tray full of drinks. One by one, she placed the drinks Jane and Diane had ordered on the table in front of them, then added 2 full shot glasses. Diane pointed to the shot glass next to her Mai Tai and glanced up at Mary. "What is this?" "Peppermint schnapps." "Peppermint. Christmas. I get it," Jane said. "Man, you guys go all out, don't you?" Mary shook her head and smiled. "The shots aren't from us." "Oh?" Diane's curiosity rose with her eyebrows. Still wearing a wide grin, Mary cut her eyes to the bar. "They're from him." Jane glanced toward the bar. It was him. The guy who'd given her candy this morning. Diane elbowed Jane. "It's your guy. You should invite him over." With her eyes still glued to him, Jane said, "What makes you think he wants me to invite him over?" Diane said, "It's not me he's staring at." Jane laughed a little, then glanced up at Mary. "Ask him if he'd like to join us." "Will do," Mary said with a wink. Jane watched the waitress go to him. They chatted for a few seconds, then he pushed himself off the bar stool and confidently headed her way. When he claimed the empty chair beside her, Jane's breath caught in her throat. He was incredibly handsome with his short blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, and a smile that could talk a girl out of her good graces. The sight of him left Jane feeling intoxicated, and she hadn't even touched her drinks. "Hi, I'm Cord Duncan." He extended his hand to her. "I'm Jane Garwood." She reached to shake his hand, but instead, he pulled hers to his lips. She almost fell into his allure, but stopped herself, saying, "Thanks for the drink." "The pleasure is all mine." He knocked back a healthy swig of his beer while eyeing the brooch affixed to the strap of Jane's dress. He set his beer on the table and looked at the pin he'd attached to his colorful yellow and black Hawaiian shirt. He lifted his gaze back to hers, disappointment filling his eyes. "It doesn't look like our party favors will end up being a match." He was right. Jane's was a flower, and his was a square. Disappointing indeed. Jane shrugged. "I wasn't too keen on this idea in the first place." She reached up to take off her pin. Cord laid a gentle hand on hers. "Don't," he said. "You rule fate. Don't let it rule you." She nodded. Sound advice. "Would you like to dance?" Jane recognized the song, the Eagles' version of "Please Come Home for Christmas." She said, "Sure," and let him pull her to her feet. Holding her hand, Cord led her to the middle of the dance floor, then wrapped her in his arms. "So, how is it that you've come to be in Hawaii alone for the holidays?" "I'm not alone," she said. "Diane's with me." "Are you two—" Jane laughed. "No." She shook her head. "Where are you from, Cord?" "Albuquerque." "No kidding." Jane didn't try to hide her surprise. "I live in Santa Fe." Albuquerque was close, very close, about an hour's drive. "Sounds like fate to me." He shrugged, then pulled Jane deeper into his embrace. A couple of hours and several drinks later, Cord glanced at his watch. 11:30. Time was running out. Soon, and sooner than he cared to admit, someone was going to walk up to Jane with that stupid matching pin and swoop her away. Cord couldn't have that. He wanted to be the last person she kissed this year, and the first and only person to kiss her next year. Cord entwined his fingers with hers. "You want to get out of here?" he asked. "Maybe go for a walk on the beach?" She took a moment to think about it, long enough for Cord's anxieties to knot up in his gut. But then she smiled and said, Yeah, I do." Cord stood and pulled Jane to her feet. She glanced around the dance floor. "I'm gonna go tell Diane we're splitting," she said, nodding toward the crowd of dancers. "I'll wait for you at the beach exit." "I won't be long," she said, backing away from him. He watched her disappear onto the crowded dance floor. He checked his watch again. 11:33. Time to get Jane out of here before someone else came along and stole her away. Cord made his way to the beach exit and lingered just off the last step leading down to the sand. It seemed like an eternity, but in reality, only a couple of minutes passed before she came into view, heading toward him with a smile. Cord went to the bottom step and offered her his hand. She took it as she descended the steps. He opted to follow the sidewalk along the beach because, well, volcanic sand was rough on the tender-footed. He didn't want to give Jane any reason to go back to the party. "It's a lot quieter out here," she said as they walked along hand in hand. "I like it." "Me too." She went silent for a brief time, then said, "How odd is it that you and I actually live in such close proximity?" She glanced up at Cord with questioning eyes. "Fate?" He shrugged. She stopped and faced him. There was a hint of delight in her tone when she said, "Wasn't it you who said something about not letting fate rule you?" "That's why we're out here." He nodded toward the party terrace. "Instead of in there." Jane looked at the empty bench ahead of them. "Want to sit?" she asked with a casual nod. Cord led her to the bench, where they both sat, and he snuggled her up against him. "It is kind of ironic, don't you think?" he asked. "Considering where we live, and we had to come all the way to Hawaii to meet." "It's a great story," Jane said. "Just imagine, people back home asking us where we met. Can you see the looks on their faces when we say Hawaii?" She laughed a little, and Cord's heart melted. He laced his fingers with hers and gave her hand a squeeze. "When are you going home?" "The 4th. You?" "Day after tomorrow." 2 days before she was scheduled to leave. Cord thought briefly about trying to change his schedule. "I'd like to see you," he said, "after we're both back home in New Mexico." "I'd like that a lot." She gazed into his eyes, and Cord couldn't help himself. He dipped his head to kiss her. She tasted like watermelon. Her lips were as inviting as the gentle caress of a soft summer breeze. Cord moved his head back. He looked at her, swallowed hard, then kissed her again. When their lips parted, Jane licked hers and said, "Wow, you're pretty good at that." "I'm just responding to you, babe." Cord laughed and caressed her soft hair back from her face. "You're not gonna dodge me when we get back to the mainland, are you?" he teased. "Not as long as you kiss like that." She laughed. Then he laughed. Jane pulled Cord's arm up and looked at his watch. He could see the number on the face, 11:44. Pretty soon, those pins would light up. "Don't you kind of feel bad for whoever our matches are?" she asked. The sentiment was there, but she made no move to do anything about it. She was with Cord, and she was staying put. That's exactly how he wanted it. "Yeah," he said, but he wasn't completely without sympathy for those they'd deserted. He added, trying to lighten the situation, "They'll be wandering around and futilely looking for their matches." "Maybe they can dance with each other," Jane remarked with a hint of laughter. Tiny lights flickered on their pins. Cord's eyes were drawn to Jane's brooch. Colors of red and green framed the flower on her pin. Jane gasped. Cord looked down at the pin affixed to his shirt. The pin, which had looked like a simple square all evening, now displayed a red and green flower. One that looked exactly like the flower on Jane's brooch. Epilogue. Christmas Day, 1 year later. Cord danced Jane around Sapphire Bay's party terrace. They were both wearing their pins from last year's ball. "Happy?" Cord asked. "Very." Jane smiled. "You?" "Ecstatic." He grinned and pulled her deeper into his embrace. "I mean, Why wouldn't I be? I'm in paradise. I have you, the most beautiful woman in the world, as my bride." He shot her a grin and a wink. It's fate. Jane couldn't argue with that. She'd seen it firsthand when she met the love of her life at a New Year's Eve party on a tiny island in the Pacific where magical things happen, at Sapphire Bay. This has been Sapphire Bay Romance 2-pack, Holiday Bride and Holiday Magic, written by Sandra Edwards, narrated by Heather Masters. Copyright 2015 by Sandra Edwards. Production copyright 2015 by Sandra Edwards.